Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to yet another evening's discussion out of Kreisky's Living Room, the new series which through the pandemic situation we are in, we have started to reach out to our audience with interesting information and interesting discussions. After the last weeks and months, really, which were loaded with a lot of tension and a lot of discussion, we have now reached some clarity, and it has become quite sure, not yet final, but quite certain, that the next president of the United States will be called Joe Biden, Vice President Kamala Harris. This, of course, has also a lot of open questions which we need to discuss. And we have with us here tonight Raimund Löw, well-known Austrian journalist and commentator, very well known to the Austrian audience. And together we will have a discussion with our guests from the United States. Ellen Laipson, good evening. Ellen Laipson is a very distinguished American scholar specializing in foreign affairs, but with a special focus on intelligence work, security politics. And she is was president of the very renowned think tank, Washington-based think tank called the Stimson Center, but has also had various functions in the State Department as well as in the National Security Council. And we are very much looking forward to discussing with her sort of the broader ramifications of this political change that is going to happen in the United States, as well as the implications of the present situation that is still prevalent. Ellen, a very warm welcome, and I'm very glad that you joined us for this discussion. Raimund and I have agreed that we would first of all invite you to give us sort of an overview from your from the present vantage point in Washington. What is the situation at the moment, and how do you read what is going to happen in the next weeks?
Thank you so much. I'm really delighted to be with you. I only wish I were in the Kreisky living room with you. We have such wonderful memories of important conferences and conversations that take place there. So we are still in it's a very big change that we've been through. Not only was there a very clear result in the national election, but the president, after 16 days, actually acknowledged that the transition must take place. And so now the resources are flowing and the president-elect is able to function in a normal way. But I think these elections will remain a rather dramatic, almost paradoxical moment where, on the one hand, American democracy demonstrated exceptional resilience and positive energy. A larger number of citizens cared about this election and showed up to vote than at any other time in our history, perhaps because of the extreme polarization that the Trump presidency represents. And yet we also all felt this deep anxiety that our democracy was very vulnerable. It was vulnerable to different kinds of interference. And in the end, we had to acknowledge that the fear of interference was less from Russia and Putin and other forms of interference than it was from ourselves, that it was from this exceptionally unusual and disruptive president, Donald Trump. So he was the one who was undermining American democratic practice and behavior. But still we must remember on Thanksgiving Day that we should be thankful that there was quite a remarkable amount of resilience. People at the state and local level behaved with discipline and realism. They were not swayed by conspiracy theories. They did their jobs, and even Republican states, in defiance of the president's wishes that they make up fictional stories about fraud, the system held together and worked. So our democracy is both stronger but also more sensitive to how vulnerable it can be. to a strong man or to ideas or to manipulation. It is also worth noting that between 2016 and 2020, our own capacity to make our elections safe improved significantly. So the Department of Homeland Security did an excellent job in stopping efforts by Russia, Iran, and China to interfere with our elections. There was less damage to the electoral process because the federal government took more seriously the responsibility to prevent such interference. You've asked about the unity theme. So Joe Biden, I think, very much he keeps repeating the sentence, I am the president of all Americans. I know that you didn't all vote for me, but I am your president too. He is deeply committed, I believe, deep in his belief system that he needs to do everything he can to unify the country. So he has to appeal to Trump voters and say, I do care about you. I care about your jobs. I care about your health care and the quality of life for you. But we have a divided culture, and the Trump world still exists, and they are very mistrustful of our institutions and of the Democratic Party. So the charge that the Democratic Party is a socialist party, that we will keep hearing that will not go away. Another point that I thought was important right at the beginning is the people around Biden over the summer have been talking about a foreign policy for the middle class. So connecting our domestic problems to our foreign policy. So whether it's economic weakness caused by COVID-19 or whether it's pre-existing weaknesses that are caused by the downside of globalization. I mean, there are anxieties. People fall out of the middle class. Jobs go overseas. These are real phenomena of the last 20, 25 years. So Biden has to somehow link his primary focus on domestic issues, whether it's public health and economy and education, etc., infrastructure, to foreign policy. So this is a little bit tricky, and I think Biden will struggle over trade. The Democratic Party has always been a little bit cautious so that we may not have an easy run to re-embrace large free trade agreements, but it's bigger than that. It's also about defense spending. It's also about how we allocate resources. And as Jake Sullivan, now named to be the National Security Advisor, wrote over the summer in a collaborative effort about this middle class question, that it's to repair the breakdown in the social contract in the United States, more inclusive economic growth. And perhaps these strategies will be a surprise to people around the world, but are very much part of Biden's effort to reunite Americans around some sense of common purpose. Just a few words about the Biden themes that we've all heard. He cares about alliances. So he will spend time restoring alliances, revalidating the centrality of alliances as part of the liberal international order. That is extremely important to him. It will come naturally to him. He will be good at it. It will happen. He's already using language like we're back, but we have to be careful that being back does not mean turning the clock back. He has to accept new realities in the international environment. The second is he really wants to work with democratic countries and says that is the best antidote to rising authoritarianism around the world. So one way he would deal with the geopolitics of Russia and China is by embracing and strengthening the democratic club. We don't know yet which technique he will use, whether it's the G7, the D10, the Alliance for Democracies that was created in the, was it the Clinton or the Obama administration that has a headquarters in Poland? There are different mechanisms that can be used to bring democratic countries together. He will care more about human rights, although we have to say the Trump administration was not silent on human rights. They did weigh in on human rights abuses and violations around the world in their own fashion. It was not always as transparent as it might be in a democratic administration, but they did pay attention to human rights. And I would say the last point about Biden's likely foreign policy is a much greater emphasis on climate change and greater transnational threats. And those are places where it is analytically profoundly true that you cannot solve these problems without international cooperation. So the Biden team, I think, will embrace multilateralism. They will embrace, but selectively. It will be multilateralism for a distinct set of problems, not necessarily for every problem set. And two areas of continuity that I would highlight for you from Obama through Trump to Biden: we will see a desire to reduce overseas military commitments, a much more careful and cautious approach to interventions of whatever kind, to stop civil wars, to respond to different kinds of crises. Asia will be more important than the Middle East. And China is, I think, the hardest problem for the Biden team will be both Iran and China, but China in particular. The baseline has moved from where we were in the Obama years, and the Democratic Party knows that. They know they have to start with a different set of assumptions about China's likely trajectory in the world and how the U.S. Will need to respond to that. So why don't I stop there?
Thank you very much, Ellen, for this overview, which is really excellent, an excellent presentation. I would suggest that before we enter into a discussion of all the foreign policy implications and the foreign policy objectives that President Biden has already outlined, let's stay for a moment with the domestic situation. Because as I see it, there are still a few hurdles that have to be taken. I mean, you have, first of all, the meeting of the Electoral College that has, which we all hope will be a formality, but in times like these, you cannot be too sure. And then you have January 5th with the election in Georgia, which is of extreme importance, whether it will be possible to obtain a majority in the Senate. And then you have the third hurdle, that's the process in the Senate with the hearings of his new candidates. Now, we have heard some sound bites of Republican senators who said, no way we are going to support anybody and to confirm anybody that is presented. Rubio has said, Senator Rubio, but also Mitch McConnell. So there are a few really serious hurdles that have to be taken. On the other side, I see that some of the people that are now suggested by President-elect Biden have already gone through a hearing and a confirmation process, like Mrs. Yellen, for instance. I think also some others. It will be very difficult, I mean, in the second instance, to refuse their nomination, then once they have already passed a successful hearing. How do you see that? I mean, these are very serious issues that are still in front of the new administration.
So first, I'm so impressed that you're all following our domestic procedures so closely. It is true that, excuse me, the behavior of the Senate is going to be absolutely critical to whether Biden has an easy presidency or a hard one. I am assuming it will be hard. I am assuming it will be like Obama with a Republican Senate, where it was extremely challenging for him to get things done. But there was a resentment towards Obama that partly might have deep racist undertones, but a resentment that he was so young and inexperienced. I think there is more respect for Biden as someone who's been in the Senate for decades, who knows these people. He and McConnell actually had a personal friendship. McConnell went to Biden's son's funeral. They've traveled together. So I'm hoping that when Trump has left town, when we have Trump in Florida and less able to manipulate and bully everyone, Maybe McConnell will remember that one of his responsibilities as the leader of the if it's a Republican Senate, is actually to get things done. And so I also think that Biden's own instincts are to put forward candidates that are both familiar, tested, and moderate. He is not putting, so far, major progressive figures from the left side of the Democratic Party that would trigger a very difficult, debate in the Senate. I am not assuming that the Democrats will be able to control the Senate. I think we should have a modest assumption that maybe one of the Georgia seats will go Democratic, but it's equally likely that they will both stay Republican. So we should not have any fantasies that this is going to be a Democrats controlling all of the branches of government. But I'm waiting to see if McConnell will remember how he has, behaved in the past. The Republican Party has been brutalized by Trump. I mean, it is a different Republican Party, and we're all waiting to see whether the Republican Party will try to re-find an equilibrium that is a little more mainstream and will allow them to, cooperate with Democrats, at least on some subjects. But Biden is totally aware of this, and I think will pick candidates that have a better chance of getting through the Senate confirmation process than others. So we have to hope. We're seeing some signs that individual Republicans have congratulated Kamala Harris. There's a little bit of human interaction going on after such a nasty political campaign. But you are right to say that, I do think there will be parallels between how paralyzed Obama was in the second half of his presidency by having a Republican Party that literally just wanted to weaken him every day. That was their main motivation. But as I say, one can hope that Biden brings a different level of collegiality with some of the Republican members of the Senate, and the problems are big problems, and he will have to find some very moderate mainstream solutions that will appeal to at least some Republicans. So if we look at who the Susan Collins came back, she's a moderate. There's still Romney. There's a handful of Republicans that will occasionally be able to vote with the Democrats.
Good to hear.
Yeah, if we start from the assumption to see how big and momentous this event worldwide had been, the defeat of Donald Trump. He had been the top populist right-wing leader in the world, and you had many mini-Trumps all over in Europe, in Asia, and other places.
Latin America, not to forget.
And in Latin America. You can see mini Trump in Brazil is perhaps not so mini, but the defeat of Trump means a big defeat for right-wing populism in the world, and it changes the dynamic of the international system, but it also changes the dynamic in many different countries where the fight is going on with right-wing populism. And here I think it's very important to see how the transition is going to go. Because, okay, one thing is the defeat, and then, okay, the person has to leave the office. So if the transition goes smoothly, despite what we have seen in the last couple of days and weeks, it's a different picture than if there is still a possibility of Trump to create mischief, to destroy maybe in advance projects of the new administration. And I wonder what do you think? What can still happen in the next 6-7 weeks? Because obviously Trump, even he's a business project, we know, but he's also a political project. And if there is a political project, then it is certainly will be to maintain his base, activated, active, to stay in politics. We don't know for sure, but it's quite possible. And to organize the transition in such a way that it looks good for him and looks good for right-wing populism would be a big problem, not only for the new administration, but also on the world scale. So I wonder, how do you see the possibilities of Trump to do politically be active on the American level as well as on international level? We have heard that there have been discussions about a possible military strike against Iran in order to prevent Biden to re-enter in negotiations with Iran and other elements.
And then before you come in, may I add one other remark? Because we said that he has been defeated in the election and he has now accepted that there will be a transition and has opened the door for sort of the transition procedures to start. At the same time, I wonder whether he has really sort of internalized what has happened. Yeah, because only today he came out with another one of his famous tweets, where he said that he has still won the election with hundreds of thousands of votes and a super majority and everything was fraudulent and so on. So the question is, I mean, in his psychological makeup, yeah, has he really accepted what has happened? And is he going to create all sorts of obstacles, and is he going to make this transition very, very difficult?
So in terms of the actual mechanics of the transition, I am not that worried. I think that the institutions understand, we've seen a couple of cabinet level officers say, please, we welcome a conversation with the Biden people. We want to transfer knowledge to you so that you'll be ready on January 20th. So in some ways, the learned behavior, the muscle memory of how we do transitions is working. I mean, it's happening on track. Donald Trump's psychology is something that, will be studied. Think of all the PhD dissertations that can be written about what happens when the American people, elect a sociopath for president. I mean, look at all the harm that can be done. He has deeply committed to this alternative reality that this was a stolen election. Some people think that it is because we questioned, that, the mainstream Americans questioned whether he was a legitimate president because of the disconnect between the popular vote and the Electoral College vote in 2016. So he is haunted by the idea that all through his 4 years of being president, there were some Americans who didn't think it was fair or right that he was president. So I think that that's what he has internalized, that the system has to be manipulated somehow. So I am deeply worried that his projecting nonstop on every channel he can find that this was a fraudulent election will be believed by tens of millions of Americans. Now, the 73 million Americans who voted for him, of those, not all of them will believe these conspiracy theories, not all of them will believe all what Obama said, the noise and the nonsense that Trump throws out. So the 73 million, maybe 40 million of them will actually believe everything Trump tells them. But we have to somehow get, mainstream Republicans back understanding what's true and what's not true. But on the point on populism, look, I think the appeal of a populist leader in the United States will remain strong as long as people have these serious grievances, as long as they have the belief that, conditions have turned against them, that it's hard to be a middle-class American anymore, that all your dreams that your children would be better off than you are gone. I mean, it's not true anymore for so much of the heartland of the United States. So we have food insecurity, we have poverty, we have children in poverty. The lines of people lining up for free food this month have been heartbreaking, absolutely heartbreaking. People who used to volunteer at food banks are now in line at the food banks. Middle-class people who can no longer put food on the table. So all the ingredients of why populism has grown stronger still exist. And whether Trump is the leader or whether some post-Trump figure picks up this theme, I think it is part of American politics for the foreseeable future. So the Democrats have a huge amount of work to do in demonstrating through what they call economic inclusiveness or inclusive economic growth, all the strategies they have for domestic policy will hopefully shift the balance a little bit. But I think all of our, open democracies have a problem of information. How do people can consume false information, and it becomes a steady part of your diet, and it's very hard in terms of what we know of cognitive capacity of people to distance themselves from information they've been told is not true. So Trump is a master at this. This is his greatest strength, is being a what do we call it, a reality show. Life is a reality show on television for Trump. He's good on television, and he's gotten probably better at appeal at some of these messages. But your question about his psychological state of mind, I think he's shocked that he lost. I think he has not yet accepted that he's lost. And so we don't know how he will behave. It sounds like I have this vision of him walking around the White House pulling, John F. Kennedy's china off the wall and throwing it and breaking it. He's very angry. He's very angry and frustrated. And so, but he also believes that he owns the Republican Party and that he has a powerful control over a significant portion of the American public. I think the hardest part is for the Republicans who want to run for the presidency in 2024. We have Mike Pompeo, we have Pence, we have Nikki Haley, we have Marco Rubio. These Republicans, can they somehow get out there and truly be an alternative to Trump for the next presidential cycle?
Do you think that on the international level he could still do something in order to create harm and make things more difficult for Biden?
Maybe he and Putin will go on vacation together. I don't know. I mean, what is it that he could do? He no longer represents, he's now a lame duck officially. You feel the power shifting away from him. In one day, that Saturday where they declared Biden the winner, you just felt for one day we didn't talk about Trump. That Trump, and you feel the power slipping away from him. So does he like to travel internationally? He'll go to his golf courses. He'll, did he really make friends internationally? Does he ruined his relationship with President Xi of China. That's not an easy collaboration anymore. Most people think that he'll go where he can make money, that his international travels or relationships will be based on places where he can build Trump hotels and try to make money.
Just as an answer also to Raimund's question, what he still can do and what he has done a couple of days ago is illustrated by the Open Skies Agreement. Yeah?
Yes.
That as a defeated president, he pulled out, and not only he pulled out of the agreement, but he, as far as I know, I don't know whether this is really true, it's something that I've read, that all the infrastructure and all the logistics that were set up for the implementation of the Open Skies Agreement, he gave instruction that it has to be destroyed to make it impossible for Biden to re-enter the Open Skies Agreement immediately.
How important is the Open Sky?
But the Open Skies Agreement
what does it mean, just for our listeners?
The Open
viewers?
Skies Agreement means that we are supervising each other's airspaces, yeah, and sort of all the military installations that are there and the military operations that are going on without interference. And that was the main point, that Russia accepted sort of supervision of its own airspace without interference, and the United States as well. And it was a very important sort of confidence-building agreement, which is now down the drain, at least for some time.
You are certainly correct that he is doing a lot of tactical things to sort of throw rocks on the road as Biden walks into the White House. There's many obstacles in his way. But a lot of the international things are fixable. It will take time, it will be harder, you'll have more lawyers, maybe it will take longer, but certainly the Paris Accord, the New START agreement, maybe open skies, there's executive authority to simply reverse some of those decisions. Iran is much trickier. The JCPOA is a more hazardous problem for Biden, partly because within the Democratic Party there was great ambivalence towards what Obama had accomplished in 2015, so that he has both within his own party and the Republican side, it will be hard for him to easily return to a more internationally accepted position on Iran. But I think many people believe that these gestures that he's doing out of anger are not too completely serious. I mean, they can be restored. There's a piece in the paper today about how many of the people that Trump fired will Biden rehire. Okay, so this terrific guy at the Department of Homeland Security that came from the private sector, that did the cyber security infrastructure for the elections, he can have his job back if he wants. The Vindeman, the national security official that got involved in the Ukraine, the impeachment trial, he may be told that he can be reinstated to federal service. There's a long list of them. So some of these things are reversible. That it may be a little bit messy and hard. I think that for Biden, one of the strongest priorities is going to be reversing some of the environmental decisions so that we can be compliant with our original, commitments under the Paris Accord.
You mentioned the fact that the nominations we have heard from the Biden camp up to now, they are from the moderate wing of the Democratic Party and should not be too complicated to get them through the Senate. But isn't that also a problem for Biden? Because the energy in the election campaign came in big part from the left, and the young people and the Black Lives Matter movement. And they will want to be part of the government, and the energy he will need in order to endure, and also in order to convince the public that this is not just a comeback of the establishment. I mean, the people who were nominated up to now, very experienced people, well-known people, but it's the establishment. So can the Biden administration be just an administration of the Democratic establishment, or do they have to get some new blood into the leadership in order to get the energy they need?
No, it's a very important issue of how he will manage the expectations of the progressive wing of the party. And here we maybe want to make a generational distinction that I think Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders will support Biden because, they're thinking more long-term and strategically. The younger progressives are impatient and will want some sign of, that Biden owes them, or that, that he has some appreciation for them. I think that the progressives care more about domestic policy than foreign policy. I think that it's possible that the Department of Labor could go to a progressive, or some of the domestic portfolios, we will see some new progressive faces. So far, we haven't seen Biden name any of his rivals, other than Kamala Harris. We haven't seen him pick up any of the faces from the 2020 primaries. So Andrew Yang or Pete Buttigieg, I hope they get jobs. I hope they get, and that doesn't solve the progressive problem per se, but it's possible that the progressives are going to overplay their hand. They're going to alienate people because they think this is a moment of revolution, and it isn't. This is not a moment to have the United States swing far to the left. That is not the national project. The national project is to try to restore some stability and sense of common purpose. And in a strange way, the timing is not good for the progressives in terms of, and Biden said a few times in the debates, he said, look at who the candidate is. I'm not Bernie Sanders. He would say, he would make it clear that the one candidate that could defeat Trump was a moderate, not a progressive. So he can push back a little bit. I think climate change and the domestic pieces of climate change, of having green economy, is one really rich area for cooperation between the moderates and the progressives in the Democratic Party. I hope the progressives are happy that he's bringing climate change into the White House with somebody as senior as John Kerry. But I think you're right to flag this issue, that Biden has got to be looking at both sides of his peripheral vision here, both how do I bring some of the Trump world back into believing that the government is trying to do good things, and how do I manage the expectations of the progressives in my own party?
I think that's a very important point, Ellen. I have the feeling, if you look at the nominations that we know so far, that his first objective was to create some kind of reassurance on the international level. Yeah? Blinken, Sullivan, Mrs. Thomas, and so on. They were not only signals internally, they were also signals to the outside world. And now he will have the opportunity to look at all the other things. And I see, for instance, the possibility with the succession to Mrs. DeVos, who was a terrible education secretary, that this is something where you could reach out also to the more progressive, to the young people with their problems, student loans, access to universities and so forth. Labor you mentioned already, social services, reassurance that the social system that is in place in the United States will not be tackled. Yeah? Mm-hmm. Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security and so forth. These are very important issues where he still can reach out also to more progressive
And there's one point that I didn't make that a little bit responds to that. He did not name a Secretary of Defense yet. Now, we're all assuming it will be Michelle Flournoy, who's a very impressive, serious, competent person, but apparently there's pushback from the progressives because she is a pro-defense industry, she will try to protect the defense budget, whereas Biden has signaled that for sure some money has to come out of the defense budget and go to domestic programs. So we're all curious whether the delay in naming the Secretary of Defense is a little bit because there's a debate within the Democratic camp on what profile do we want for the Secretary of Defense.
Yes. Let's talk about the perspective in international politics under a Biden administration. Everybody says, you also mentioned it, China will be the most difficult, one of the most difficult points, and that is also, I think, interesting for Europe, because for Europe it's if the next couple of years are going to be years of a continuing confrontation, Cold War-like confrontation between China and the US. I mean, Europe is between a rock and a hard place, as they say, because the question will be, do we have to take sides or don't we have to take sides? And for me, it was striking that there was one point where the Democrats and the Republicans were pretty much on the same line, which was hard line against China. Where Biden was criticizing Trump, that he made overtures towards Xi Jinping and the other way around. Now, my impression is that the Chinese at the first they didn't exactly know how to cope with the situation that Trump is going away, but they were used to his chaotic behavior. They could cope with it. But they might realize that it's maybe also better for them to have a superpower that's less chaotic, can be calculated. You know what they are going to do. There's been recently an article in the New York Times by a very important person, Madame Fu, in the Chinese foreign policy establishment, arguing, well, let's try and get a reasonable way of dealing between China and the US. So I wonder, I mean, how and of course, given the fact that Democrats and Republicans both are hardline against China, would it be possible or would it be difficult for a Biden administration just to, on some areas, open up overtures towards China? I mean, not in human rights and so on, of course, but the Biden administration could let Chinese journalists, correspondents back into the US, which would be a sign of détente on that level, and the Chinese could let the New York Times correspondent back to Beijing. So other signs of that order also on Huawei. I mean, if the pressure is reduced to get the financial person in Huawei who is under semi-arrest in Canada into the US, into the US judicial system, that would also be seen in China as a sign that it doesn't have to be a new Cold War. How do you see the margin of maneuver of the Biden administration here?
Well, you know, we've had lots of conversations about, is the Cold War a good analogy for the trajectory of U.S.-China relations? And, you know, right now you can make more arguments why it's not the right analogy, but that may not be true over time, because as China becomes more ambitious and more explicit about its ambitions, then it starts to, you know, and how China now says openly, we want to change the rules. You know, we represent more than half of the world's population, you know, if you take all of Asia collectively, et cetera. So I think the baseline has changed. I think that Trump advanced an American interest agenda by saying we've been too complacent, we've been too compliant of letting, and that the imbalance between what China benefited from our economic generosity and how we benefited, it's way off base. So I think that that is actually perhaps Trump's greatest legacy in foreign policy, is that he woke us up, or he shook up the assumptions about where China is and how China will represent a long-term challenge, if not threat, to the United States. Within the Democratic Party, I'm not as focused on the small tactical kind of confidence-building measures that could be done to slightly lighten the mood in U.S.-China relations. I think the Democrats still have some conceptual, you know, debating to do about how you blend both the competitive and the cooperative pieces. What I think is very clear to the Biden camp is that, of course, it's competitive. Of course, it's a competitive relationship in many ways. Security in the Indo-Pacific region, it's all about China. It's all about, whether you want to call it containing China or setting red lines or reasserting American security interests in the Indo-Pacific region. All of that's a big, hard security problem set. The cooperative side could be, you know, pandemic and climate change, full stop. I mean, if we could have a more productive interaction with Chinese experts, Chinese government, Chinese authorities on these mega transnational threats, I think that would play to some of Biden's, you know, hopes for how the international system should work, that we should be able to be both competitive and cooperative, and we have to somehow manage that dual nature of the relationship. So whether there's some, you know, early low-hanging fruit like journalism or et cetera, I don't know if they have that lined up for the early months of the new presidency, but I still think there's a debate within Democratic circles about how to conceptualize the China problem. And, you know, and trade is going to be tricky. The technology stuff is going to be tricky. I personally think they'll stay tough on Huawei, 5G, all those issues. I think the Democrats will more or less stick with some of the strategies that the Trump administration had pursued. I think the Treasury Department is a more important player in international relations now, in part because they control this committee that's supposed to be looking at foreign investment in the U.S., of whether there's security implications to it. So I think there will be a tough-mindedness towards some aspects of the China relationship, but still a desire to find some very big issues in which there's still a spirit of global cooperation with the Chinese.
I think for the Europeans it will be interesting if this idea that Europeans have to take side is maintained. And that has been happening in the last couple of months with Pompeo traveling through Europe and telling the governments, well, you should kick out Huawei because otherwise we don't like you anymore, and that may have consequences. So if this persists, I think it's difficult. But if there is a way, if this continues, this idea that European governments or the European Union as such has to take sides against China or for China against the US or for the US, and that was, Huawei was the case where the Pompeo and the Trump administration tried to play that card.
I think it's an extremely important issue from the European perspective, because taking sides is exactly what we do not want to do. Yeah, I mean, Europe is very interested in economic relations, good, stable economic relations to China. At the same time, there's a growing awareness that there is also security implication in this relationship, and that there are sort of international ambitions in the Chinese politics which have to be taken seriously. So we, in a way, we are looking towards some kind of approach from the United States that signals we are not obliged to take sides here, but where these security concerns and the long-term political concerns can also be seriously discussed and argued.
Yes. So I do understand that NATO, wants to sort of have at least have a conversation that will involve NATO members in, how the Asia-Pacific region affects global stability, etc., and a little bit of a conversation that Japan, Australia, Korea, and NATO need to somehow have this sort of consultative process, even if there's a kind of natural division of labor. I mean, I had always thought that the United States was actually quite uninterested in European views of China for a long time, and then slowly realized that actually Europe has a very productive economic interaction with East Asian countries without having the burden of having to think of this as a security problem set. We are a Pacific power, so we have Pacific responsibilities, and so the security piece of it is much more organic for the United States than it would be for European countries. So it's possible that it will settle out at some division of labor, that the United States doesn't expect European powers to participate in, I don't know, military exercises in the South China Sea, but we should at least have a dialogue about whether we have shared principles about Chinese behavior. If China starts to behave in international organizations in a way that is trying to change the rules, I could imagine European countries, the preservation of what we call the liberal international order, which was always really the Western liberal order. But I think Europe does have a stake in whether China gets to the point of thinking that it can transform international organizations into institutions that protect the sovereignty of nations and actually trivialize the extent of shared sovereignty or joint action. So I think over time, Europe will realize it does have to participate in this process, but maybe it will always have a very minor role to play in the hard security arena.
If I may, I would like to discuss a little bit Iran, because the Europeans are very, very interested to re-establish decent relations with the Iranian leadership. The nuclear deal has been not completely abandoned, but it's not very much alive anymore. And it is also, I mean, if the new administration gets into serious discussions in order to get back into the Iran deal, it has huge consequences for the whole Middle East. I mean, I'm sure the Saudis are very nervous. I'm sure Bibi Netanyahu is very nervous because they all were on a very hard line against Iran, and they remember the time of the Obama administration where the nuclear deal has been very controversial, and the Israeli government tried to prevent it many times, and the Saudis and other were adamantly against. So it would, I mean, if there would be a sign from the Biden administration, yes, we want to get back into this kind of relationship, it would change a lot of things in the Middle East. So I heard you sort of, your hints, you're not so sure it will really happen because the Democratic Party is not very eager to get into such a controversial foreign policy issue. Is that right? Is that your feeling?
So, look, if I had my druthers, we could just declare that we are back in the agreement still exists. European, Germany, France, UK, EU, China, Russia are all still in the agreement. So if I'm not a lawyer, my strong preference would be that we just declare that the agreement still exists and we think it's still useful to have this agreement, and that, but where we are is back again to a bilateral dialogue between the U.S. and Iran, and we can't stand each other and we don't trust each other, okay? So the best case would be improved compliance for improved compliance. So the U.S. lifts some of the sanctions and the Iranians stop, enriching large quantities of low-enriched uranium, and they turn off some of the centrifuges, etc. The people who really watch domestic Iran here say Iran doesn't care. They don't think that Biden is better than Trump. They need, the confrontation with the U.S. is so deeply embedded in their politics that they're not highly motivated to take that, to change their behavior in the interest of, we've always assumed that economic pain was the best lever we had on the Iranians. And, it's not clear that that alone would be sufficient. So the Iranians love to make it look like this is a peer relationship that we owe them instead of they owe the international community. But I would have very low expectations that the Iranians want to re-engage in that kind of a dialogue. More importantly, as I guess I implied earlier, this isn't so easy for the Democrats. The Democrats do need to demonstrate that they're taking seriously the other parts of Iran's behavior that is problematic. So the JCPOA is only dealing with one issue. It's not dealing with all the issues. So, I don't think that the Iran agreement is going to be one of the early breakthroughs of the Biden administration. And I worry deeply that the Iranians are okay with an agreement that's kind of partially implemented. They can rhetorically behave the same way Trump does. They can say any day of the week that they like the agreement or they don't like the agreement, and they leave us all in a state of uncertainty. What I can also say, though, is that Trump never delivered to the Israelis and the Gulf countries on Iran. He talked tough. It was maximum pressure, but he clearly was avoiding, any strong military action. Killing Soleimani is sort of the outlier event. Perhaps that was the one that doesn't quite fit in the pattern, but he loved to talk tough about Iran, but he never really gave them what they wanted. And I think towards the end of the Trump administration, I'm told by people who've talked very recently to the Saudis that the Saudis were pretty disappointed in Trump by the end. They didn't think that Trump really had their back on Iran. And people misunderstood Trump's view. Trump's view was, I'm going to embrace you rhetorically, politically. I'm going to give you all this expensive weapons, and then you do what you think you have to do. He really was not promising that the U.S. would somehow swoop in as the, Deus ex machina and make the Iran problem go away. That was never. He had a very confusing and contradictory message on Iran, but I think his interest in avoiding new wars was the overriding interest. And I'm told by the end that neither the Gulf countries or the Israelis were very happy with Trump's Iran policy.
There are two things which I would like to add. The first one is that John Kerry is coming back into government, and he's one of the American politicians who knows, or who has been very heavily involved in the negotiation of the Iran agreement, and so has Jake Sullivan. Jake Sullivan was on a negotiating team, and both of them were in Vienna many, many times for the long rounds of negotiations that we had and that preceded the agreement. So you have people coming in that are aware of the problems and that know the agreement very well, and all the sort of the nitty-gritty that is involved in it. And I think that is also due, if we take a broader look at the whole of the Middle East, that people are coming back into government who know what they are doing and who have a long experience. And I think that in dealing with a situation that is so fraught with tensions, and we not only have the unresolved Israeli-Palestinian issue, you have the whole imbalance in the region. You have Lebanon, a particular problem, the foreign policy adventures of Iran with Hezbollah and so on. So it's very, I think it's in a way a comforting thought that people are coming back into government positions and into the administration who have a long experience and know what they are going to do. This taking sides that was so pronounced of the Trump administration, you know, embracing Saudi Arabia, embracing Israel, ignoring all the other issues, that was not helpful in the long run, because it added to the imbalances in the region.
No, I quite agree, but I would also take as a premise that the Biden administration has said pretty clearly the Middle East is not going to be the center of the universe for us. And they've even said that, think how many American presidents declared that the American role in the Middle East was to prevent some other outside power from interfering. It mostly meant the Soviet Union, but it could have been, in theory, other outside actors. I've heard some of the Biden Middle East advisors be very kind of relaxed about Russia's role in the Middle East, or even China's increasing involvement in the Middle East, at least economically, not yet too much more than that. But they've kind of backed off and said, the Middle East is an open market and people come and go, and we're not going to be there militarily in any significant numbers, but we want to have, cooperative relations with all the countries of the region is kind of the premise. Remember that, Obama actually had a strategic concept, which was that, persuading Iran to avoid nuclearization could lead to a reconciliation between Iran and Saudi Arabia, that would transform the politics of the region, etc. And the region hated Obama for saying that. They just did not want to be, even the idea that they should reconcile themselves to Iran was very disturbing and offensive to them. So I'm not sure Biden will put it in such grand terms anymore, even though fundamentally I do think that's probably part of their view. I argued in a piece recently that Libya might strangely be a place where, because the diplomacy process is moving in the right direction, that the Biden administration could, show that it cares about ending Middle East conflicts and embrace UN diplomacy and multilateralism. I think that they will selectively look at places in the Middle East where they think they can make a difference through diplomacy, not through military intervention. That will be an important criteria. Will they have a grand vision for the whole region? I doubt it. I don't expect it.
Can we have a look at a little bit at Europe and the European expectations in European politics? I mean, when the first signals that we have heard, reaffirmation of a commitment to multilateralism, to the United Nations system, to international agreements, rejoining the Paris Accord, and all this was very, in a way, comforting for Europe, yeah? And it was exactly that what we expected to hear and what we like to hear. The question is really, I assume that the Biden administration will also have some expectations from Europe, what we are supposed to do, and not only what we expect the Americans to do for Europe.
So I do think that there's a deeper trend towards greater regional responsibility. The first sort of solution to regional problems should come from the region itself. I think that is emerging as a norm, if you will. The UN certainly moved in that direction many years back. So I wouldn't be surprised if the Biden administration takes a gentler approach towards greater European self-sufficiency, including security, some of Macron's ideas. I think that they may be a little more relaxed about that. During the Cold War, we always said we wanted Europe to take more responsibility. We always punished Europe if they tried. That there was always this funny dialectic about that we really didn't want to cede any authority or primacy of the U.S. Circumstances have changed, and there's greater, I think, flexibility about regional organizations or regional systems wanting to, take more responsibility. And I do think it fits into the pattern of the United States just saying, we have to be more selective about where we get involved. Having said that, I don't want to overstate it, because I think Biden will be thrilled to be back in interaction and friendly solidarity with Europe. I think that he will enjoy that part of his job. I think he will be sending some very strong messages of solidarity and shared values, etc. But I do wonder whether on these specific security problems and even, let's be honest, the Libya intervention of 2011 was an important moment where the United States put down the marker that certain problems in the world are more a European obligation than an American obligation. So it's been happening over time. Anyway, I don't know if that at least partly answers the question, but I think Biden will be a very friendly, genuinely cares about the alliance, genuinely cares about allies, but also will be respectful of Europeans' own initiatives.
And he has also taken the European Union as an organization seriously, while Trump was always very dismissive and talked about Brussels in very derogatory terms and preferred much more to take sort of individual dealings with individual countries. Biden has already signaled that he sees sort of the European Union, also his message to Boris Johnson about Brexit was a very clear signal in that regard.
And I think, political signals coming from Washington can make a difference in the situation where the Europeans are now, with Hungary and Poland being on a course of confrontation. If the signals from Washington to Warsaw will be please don't exaggerate, and to Budapest, don't get crazy. Stop this business. Yeah, we want Europe to be unified. It will have an effect, and it will have a bigger effect than many signals coming from Brussels. Yeah? Yeah. And even for London, even for Brexit, I mean that will play out probably in the next couple of days. But the fact that the new administration in the US does not like Brexit is a factor that Boris Johnson has to take into consideration.
Yeah. I think that's a very important point. And we also have to see that in some respects, I mean, parts of Europe are dealing with an unexpected inheritance of the Trump administration, because things that were introduced by Trump and by the Trump administration have resonated in some European countries very strongly. Yeah? And when we hear now fake news in Hungary and in Poland, We have it in Turkey and so forth. You know, this authoritarian behavior, derogatory remarks about government, about elites, and so on. All these are things that originally came out of Washington, but that was swapped over to Europe, and we are dealing with that now.
So but I think that some white supremacy ideology, people believe it flowed the other way, that there were, you know, ideological movements in Europe that actually influenced the United States. So I wouldn't exaggerate that Trump was somehow the inventor of all of these political concepts. You know, the man literally did not understand the job description of being president, but he had some deep, visceral political views. And one was that, you know, sovereignty at the nation-state level is all that matters. I mean, so he had a genuine disdain for multilateralism. He didn't get it. He thought it was, you know, sort of a sign of weakness. He saw it as a sign of giving up some of your sovereign power and authority. So, you know, that is a pre-existing condition. But then if you add migration crisis and COVID, even Europe has had to put up its boundaries again. You know, even the integrated Schengen Europe is reverting, and that's not all about Trump. That's about empirical conditions on the ground. So, you know, Trump's not wrong completely that in the end, many societies revert to this sovereign nationalism as the best source of security. Not everybody gets the pooled sovereignty or the true spirit of multilateralism.
Thank you. There are so many issues that we could go on for another hour to discuss them, I think, and even then not coming to an end. But it has been a very interesting talk, and thank you very much, Ellen, for joining us. I think there are some things we see a little bit clearer now, and we'll hope for the best what the next couple of weeks will bring. I mean, the situation is not easy, and the new people have the work cut out for them.
Absolutely, yeah.
Raimund?
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think it was fascinating. I think you mentioned that at the start you were surprised we were following American politics so much. Everybody does in Europe.
Everybody does.
Everybody
yes,
does. Yes.
Especially people who are so close to the United States as the two of us.
And sometimes we want to take a break from it. Sometimes we just want to say, you know, we're saturated with it's this 2020 is going to go down as one of the worst years for many, many reasons. But some of us, I think, are you know, relieved that our system, our institutions were resilient enough to survive a true, you know, test. It was a stress test of American democracy. And it doesn't mean that Biden has all the answers. He doesn't. He looks a little tired sometimes. You know, we do worry that he will certainly be a one-term president. And so the politics will, you know, never stop. We'll be back in a political cycle very soon. But thank you. I enjoyed the conversation. I wish you all the best.
Thank you very much for joining us. And I hope one of these days we will see you again physically here in Vienna.
That would make me very happy. Thank you.
Okay,
bye-bye.
Thank you.